Hey listeners, if you like this podcast, check out our other shows, The Study Table and Training Table. Listen to archived content and in-depth interviews with insiders working with student athletes. It's on our website, www.fredopie.com. Welcome to the Dinner Table, a discussion with food as a lens into cultures and societies. I'm your host, Fred Opie. So what you're about to hear is a panel discussion hosted by the Rho Nu chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity, Incorporated at MIT. Rho Nu encompasses the campuses of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Harvard University, Tufts University, and includes students from Babson College. The panel consists of me, Frederick Douglas Opie, a professor of history and foodways at Babson College, and my colleague David Price, who is a Harvard Divinity School student. During the panel discussion, we contrast the Black Panther Party for self-defense of the late 1960s with the Black Lives Matter movement of today. Particularly interesting is the contrast between the left of center Black Panther Party and its appropriation of the Second Amendment right, which calls for citizens to have the right to bear arms, as a strategy to end police brutality in Oakland, California, where the party started and quickly spread across the country to places such as Chicago, New York, and Boston. My interest in the Black Panther Party started with learning about its free breakfast program and later how it used a grocery giveaway to register voters. Today, it is conservatives who fight for limited restriction on gun ownership and liberals and progressives who seek tighter restrictions on them. A look at the Black Panther Party's armed patrolling of their neighborhoods to end police brutality in the 1960s is interesting when compared to white conservatives in the states of Nevada and Oregon, who in 2015 and 2016 occupied with guns the Bureau of Land Management property, declaring their cattle had the right to graze there for free. The Panthers can best be described as a movement influenced by Marcus Garvey and the UNIA and its cultural organizational structure, and with Patrice Lumumba and Che Guevara's political leanings. So it's an interesting talk, and I hope you enjoy the panel. So I've been collecting sources on the Black Panther Party for about the last 3 years. But my work focuses on food and the Panthers, and I knew a little bit about the free breakfast program that you all talked about, but if you also look at number 10 of the 10-point plan, it speaks directly to that. We want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. So that was one of their programs. So I went out and I started doing research, and there's a lot of newspaper sources on the Panthers, and then I went to Standford University, which has the UP Newton collection. Went through the entire collection, photocopied everything related to the Panthers, and you would be amazed at how much of number 10 is available in sources that the Panthers wanted to do. I decided I was going to do a graphic novel. Mm-hmm. You can catch a lot of people's attention and trick them into reading your book, and then they learn a lot of information in the process. Number 1, it's the Black Panther Party for self-defense. So the context of the Black Panther Party is police brutality, which is directly related to Black Lives Matter. What was happening in the city of Oakland is you had a predominantly African-American community policed by a predominantly white police force. And they were just doing whatever they wanted when they would stop people. And people were regularly getting beat up, young people, young black people. UB Newton at the time was going to law school, so he knew the U.S. Constitution. And the Constitution says the right to bear arms. And if you don't realize that, there's some folks out in Oregon right now that have guns out and are daring the FBI and any part of the government on federal land because they were using it for pasture land. The government wanted to shut down the pasture land, and they said, over my dead body and my gun. And UP Newton was in law school, so he started talking about this stuff as a way of dealing with police brutality. So when anytime something was going on, they would show up with their guns, and 10 yards away, they'd watch the interaction. Police started acting right after that. Police started getting really nervous, but it's perfectly legal. There's nothing violent about carrying a gun. It's part of your constitutional rights. Now, Black Lives Matter, in that particular point of policing the police,
right.
What do you see as an overlap?
When we talk about policing and ending institutional racism that is embedded in policing practices that the police are taught in a number of different ways, both formally and informally when they're being trained. Then you go to the body politic. I don't know if you all read Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, but he writes this letter to his young son about what it means to be black growing up in Baltimore. And he basically tells his son, you are not really in control of your body. Police are. And so one of the things that both the Black Panther Party and the Black Lives Matter movement attempts to do is to reclaim the black body and give it back to the people who it belongs to. And so when you talk about policing the police, that's literally what we're trying to do, is reclaim our own bodies to say that you cannot destroy this, particularly without my permission or me doing something that's against the law. And so I think of the police body cameras as one way of the police policing themselves and allowing the community to police the police as well. Secondly, police review boards, community police review boards. If you look at Newark, New Jersey, they have just passed an ordinance where community members will sit on police review boards for any police misconduct, any police killings. And so literally community members will be reprimanding, in some instances, police officers who break citizens' constitutional rights. That's one way the Black Lives Matter movement is pushing this idea of the community policing the peace officers.
The Black Panther Party originated out of a Black Panther movement in Lowndes County, Alabama. There's a book by a friend of mine named Hassan Jeffries. It's called something like Lowndes County, Alabama. The symbol for the self-determination group that was in Lowndes County, Alabama was the Panther. And that's where the Black Panther got that symbol from this self-determination group, where this is one of the few places in the Deep South that if the Klan came in and tried to do something, they had a organization of black men, many of them leaders in their church, deacons and things like that in their church, who were armed, and at any time somebody would try to come in, like the Klan, to try to, to push the people out, try to take the best land, run some out of town. A lot of the conflicts that happened in the South in which a person was killed, right. Well, if you tried to mess with those people, those black men would come out and they would run you out of town. So that's where this whole principle started with the Black Panthers. In contrast to the civil rights movement, the Black Panthers were calling for a radical change in American society. They weren't calling for reform. Huey P. Newton and the leadership of the Panthers were calling for a socialist change in the government, where the means of production would be owned by the people, particularly black people, because there were too many communities in which people who owned those businesses were not from that community. They were making profits and then going back to their suburbs where they lived. Dr. King was not calling for things like that until late in his career when people began to condemn him. What do you think about that related to Black Lives Matter and what they're calling for? How radical, is it a reform movement or is it a radical movement?
I would call it sort of a reform movement because unlike the Black Panther Party, there isn't this agreed upon framework or set of points that the Black Lives Matter movement is pushing for. Although we seek to deconstruct racism, institutional racism, there is no particular set of ways that the party seeks or the movement seeks to do that. And I think one of the reasons is it's leadership. It's all decentralized. There isn't a hierarchy within the movement. Yes, there are chapters, and even within those chapters, there aren't really presidents or leaders or heads of those chapters. Whereas for the Black Panther Party, there was certainly a hierarchy. But one thing I do want to speak about that is the role of women in both parties. I think it's extremely interesting when you look at the both the movement and the Black Panther Party. Women played a significant role. Now in the Black Lives Matter movement, queer women are playing an even greater role and are out about who they are and what they are.
Something that's different is the Panther Party had women, but the party definitely suffered from chauvinism. Women were the lifeblood of the party, but not in the leadership position. Very few women. Black Lives Matter, I think, is much more progressive in how it looks at women and the role that women have in that movement. The long-term legacy of both movements. The free breakfast program put so much pressure and shame on the U.S. government that the free breakfast program that is federally sponsored in public school systems today came from the Black Panther Party. If you were wealthy enough to go to college, you'd be exempt from being in the Vietnam War. If you were poor and black, poor and white, poor and Hispanic, or anything else, you were going to be fighting that war. So you had wealthy individuals, largely white males, making the decisions about black, brown, and whatever other colored bodies being on the front line. So even though African Americans made up 10% of the population, they were more than 50% of the troops on the front line taking the biggest hits and casualties. So that's why they were against the Vietnam War.
I think in addition to sort of not wanting to be drafted is this idea that I'm not going to assist a government that oppresses me to then help them oppress another community. I think you hear that in some of Muhammad Ali's comments about not getting drafted, and most certainly coming from the Black Panther Party. They just didn't want to represent a government who oppressed them and to help that same government use the same tools of oppression to then go ahead and oppress other communities of color in other parts of the world.
Are there any questions? So glad you brought up COINTELPRO, because one of the reasons why the Panthers are no longer in existence today is because our tax dollars went in to systematically, listen to what I'm saying, assassinate the leadership of the Panthers. And that's something that makes it very difficult to repress Black Lives Matter. There is no single leader. Versus the Panthers, the goal was to target specific leaders, take them out, or cause them all kinds of misinformation that you talked about. And by the end, Huey P. Newton, he was schizophrenic. Most people think he might have been bipolar, and he just kind of went off the rails because of the FBI program of misinformation and to destroy the Panthers from within.
What is your take on Angela Davis and her as kind of like a figurehead being associated with the Black Panther Party?
You all remember when you would sit on your mom's lap and you would rest your head on your mom's breast, and when you would talk, you would hear this echo chamber? You remember that when you were little? I grew up on the lap of my mother at free Angela Davis meetings and rallies. So buttons on my mom's, she used to wear one of them leather vests like they did back in the 70s with all the buttons on them and stuff. For a long time, I knew about Angela Davis. And she was in jail during a large part of the Black Panther Party. So when she finally got out of jail, when she was in jail, just like when Huey P. Newton was in jail, she was a magnet for blacks to come together and support. But again, she's another one who was a committed socialist, committed to the overthrow of a capitalist society. I think she's a very important part of the movement. I don't know if she was aware of just how much sexism was going on, because the challenge is having a movement that's doing good things and then critiquing that movement.
Right.
That's not always so easy to critique your own movement. We'll be right back. For more interviews and related content, you can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, and other podcast distributors. Also, check out our website at www.fredopie.com. Ask questions on Facebook at Frederick Douglas Opie and on Twitter at Dr. Fred D. Opie. For information about advertising on the show, please email us at fdopie@gmail.com. That's fdopie@gmail.com.
If you're enjoying the show, check out the episode entitled Young Lord's Breakfast Program on the Dinner Table show page.
The free breakfast program was a cornerstone of the community work done by the Young Lords. It was actually something that was inspired and something that we emulated from the Black Panther Party.
Now back to the show.
This movement is the antithesis of what we understand a normal movement, a civil rights movement to look like. And it's purposely designed that way. The goal of the movement wasn't to look like the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Sometimes I sit back and wonder if there was a centralized leadership, what would it look like? Who would compose that leadership? And what would the points be, and how would we come to that consensus? I think the goal of the movement is for everything to be very local. There's this saying that all politics are local, right? Everything that happens at city council meetings, happens, at the state level. Very few things happen at a national, federal level that has their direct impact and effect on your life from day to day. I think there will be benefits if local chapters might have some sort of agreed upon leadership, but I think it's up to that chapter. I think it depends on what they believe is right and will be most effective for that community. I haven't joined a Black Lives Matter chapter. I know of people who have joined those chapters, and they have concerns about whether or not the protest is enough, whether or not presenting 10 points as to what is needed in their community is necessary, and then going and demanding that. Many chapters have done that. And I think that they have been successful in some ways. For example, like the community police review, police body cameras, things of that nature. These have been sort of the demands that particular communities have and chapters have asked for. And so they've gotten it. I don't necessarily think that there would be a huge benefit in having sort of this national one sort of leader like a Dr. King or a Malcolm X that would move the movement into a particular direction that's better than where it's going.
Keep in mind, in 1968, there are radical armed movements around the country within the white student population. In 1968, you have 4 students killed in Ohio protesting against the Vietnam War. So it's not just the Panthers who are taking up arms. They're not blowing up buildings. You have a group called SDS, Students for Democratic Society. I mean, they're an underground, the Weathermen is another underground armed group. Another thing you see that comes out of the Black Panther movement, Students for Democratic Society and those other movements, is this whole war on drugs and the rise of the prison industrial complex, which is something else that Angela Davis, as a former incarcerated political prisoner, was against. That period of coming up with these laws that will give you 3 strikes and you're out, laws that if you are convicted of a crime, that you will lose your right to the franchise, you're no longer able to vote or hold public office. All that stuff comes out of 1968. There's a book that you all should know by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow, and it talks about what has happened with the growth of the prison industrial complex, the building of prisons and the warehousing of particularly black and brown men. All that stuff comes out of that. And that is one of the most, if there is a platform, the Black Lives Matter movement, it's against police brutality and the ending of the prison industrial complex. Would you agree?
I would definitely agree with that. And I think it sort of starts in our schools. I don't know if you all went to public school. When I was going to public school, police officers were always there. Yeah. It seemed like a normal part of school life until I met some of my white counterparts at Georgetown who said they ain't seen a police officer at school ever. So what do you mean? Like, no, police officers are at school like all the time. Resource officers.
Armed with guns.
Armed with guns. Young black men and women's interaction with law enforcement starts way early than any other group of people in America, really. And so it's a pipeline stemming from school, going through from elementary school to middle school to high school, and then ended up in our prison system. And Michelle Alexander talks about ways in which that has sort of increased the number of black men, particularly in our prison system.
You talked about Tallahassee Coates' book, and by the way, it won the National Book Award. The last book to win a National Book Award written by an African American was Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison in 1954, 1955. It's a small book. It would be worth it. Now, Tallahassee's dad was a Black Panther. A lot of the stuff that he talks about, the knowledge of history among African Americans and in our community in general, again, that's something that comes out of the Black Panther Party. And he is a product of the Black Panther Party. So it makes a huge difference. Race people were any people who studied their history. Carter G. Woodson and people like that. You don't grow up in a home where those books are available to you, you're not going to get the context all this. So the Panther Party, you can learn about them through what other folks say, or you can read a lot of the memoirs of members of the Panther Party and learn it for yourself, what they're all about. Shootouts happen, But it wasn't that the Panthers initiated the shootouts. It was scared police officers or black informants that were working undercover. These stories are not often told. What's told and what's glorified are black men carrying guns. There's a guy, one of the most famous photographers of the civil rights movement. The guy was an informant. He was an informant. It's incredible. And he did it for money. You know, if you think about most slave rebellions that I've studied, including Denmark Vesey, South Carolina, most slave rebellions, the other one, Nat Turner in Virginia, in Hampton, Virginia, where, by the way, Allen Iverson is from the same area, those revolts were unsuccessful because, so it's a slave deciding, I need to keep this from happening. One of the most important slave revolts that happens during the book, not the movie, but the book 12 Years a Slave, is this famous slave revolt that's being organized in Louisiana. And the guy that turns coat is the guy that organizes the movement. Harriet Tubman used to carry a gun for folks like that. If you got scared, she's gonna take you out. She said, well, you can either go or you can die right here. A lot of times that's what the problem is within our community, we don't have the strength or the conviction to see the thing out.
Particularly for some of the more well-known figures like D. Ray McKesson. Like, the FBI is definitely following, and he knows it. He will openly say it. And the FBI has, they were following his Twitter page, right? And tapping into his phone to figure out where sort of the next protests were happening. And somehow they found out, BLM found out. And basically the FBI said it was not as a means to sort of tear down the movement, but rather to support and provide some sort of cover and protection for the community.
The biggest lawsuit that's about to come on the Supreme Court is this one over between...
Apple?
Apple, yeah. It's all over access to data between the FBI, the government, and Apple. Apple doesn't want to give up the data, and they're like, oh, we're going to take you to court. So there's a good and a bad to what we're talking about. I mean, I would want some groups infiltrated, just not mine.
Right. And what's particularly fascinating about that as well is thinking back to the Black Panther Party and sort of their socialist framework that they work through. There's a lot of parallels, but BLM doesn't really think about socialism in the same way that the Black Panther Party did. And I think that's, again, attributed to the decentralized leadership style.
The Panthers, when we tell you that they were radical, when they went to exile, they didn't go to capitalist societies. They went to socialist societies. So that is the context. Black Lives Matter is not calling for a revolutionary change in our economic system. You know, Booker T. Washington was not calling for socialism. He was calling for a piece of the pie. He just wanted a black piece of the pie.
Right.
The Black Panthers, they wanted a whole new pie. They wanted a cake. So that's a radical change, and why they were so forcibly repressed by COINTELPRO.
The Black Lives Matter movement is more narrowly focused on police brutality specifically, validating black life, just being an American citizen and not being killed on the street. Whereas the Black Panther Party was a much more broad, it included...
The problem is the system.
Exactly. The system itself needed to be changed. And yes, the Black Lives Matter movement attempts to do that and speak against that. But the Black Panther Party offers a new way of doing that I believe that the Black Lives Matter movement just hasn't gotten to yet.
This is a question I want to ask you all. What's the difference between a riot and a movement?
When I hear riot, I think of very unorganized chaos, aggression aimed in all types of directions without a set of motivations or a set of things to accomplish by taking those actions, just kind of anarchy. When I hear a movement, I think of objectives, people on the street with a cause, marching for something, like there's some kind of leadership taking them wherever they're going, and there's a bigger picture in mind. Whatever happens is supposed to advance the movement.
So, anybody else?
I mean, I agree with your movement, like definitely long term, going towards like a goal, some type of overarching goal. But regarding a riot, to me, it's some sort of like rebellion. The catalyst of that is that there must be some sort of oppression or some sort of disenfranchisement taking place where you feel like you have to. That's why you riot. It's out of anger, basically.
One thing, just a reaction to that. I think movements are also a reaction to oppression, whatever it may be. When I think of the difference between riot and a movement, I think of one word, violence. So I associate more violence with it. Right?
In your mind, a movement wouldn't have violence?
Not as much.
U.S. going into Iraq, is that a movement or is it a riot?
I wouldn't consider it either.
I mean, I just want you all to think about these things. The other question I often ask, to make it even more controversial, do movements make leaders or do leaders make movements?
Inspired by movement, taken into, and then have that passion drive them to lead the movement. I still think that in the case, I want to look at like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X as like, okay, these are leaders who made movements, but like...
Look at Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. You don't really have a leader, but it's a movement. And some people describe it as riots. Now, you had Missouri and you had Baltimore. Mm-hmm. Was one a movement? Was one a riot? And do you take the interpretation of media that says it's a movement or a riot, or what do you do? Because you could read one paper and listen to one analysis and it's called a riot. Other ones say, oh, that's a movement. You don't think movements arise out of oppression?
I think they do. I mean, it's in a way, it's almost one and the same, but maybe the riot comes before the movement.
And can a movement become a riot, and can a riot become a movement?
It's like a movement can definitely become a riot.
What about the reverse? I mean, these are important questions, because you could go into a situation like Baltimore as an organizer, like A. Philip Randolph, Bernard Rustin. I mean, there's a lot of them, Angela Davis. Mm-hmm. And you could take what just happened and create a movement. That's important. I mean, it's just like an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur goes into a situation and creates markets. You create a market for your product. And I think it's the same thing when it comes to, and I say this to you because you guys are young enough. You could be at the front of this. You could help organize this. There's a lot of things you can do. A strategist looks at a situation and says, what can you do with this? Do we have a pity party, or do we turn the energy here into a positive way? You know, I think of the wildebeest. So they're all just running. They don't know where they're going until somebody takes leadership. You're not helpless. The fact that you got the education you do now, there's a lot of things you can do. You just have to decide, do I want to be in a movement, or do I want to watch the riot? To check out our podcast archive, suggest show topics, and advertise on the show, and to book me as a guest and or speaker, visit our website, www.fredopie.com. That's www.fredopie.com. For information about advertising on the show, please email us at fdopie@gmail.com. That's fdopie@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and be good.